The engine core of the Zephyrian flagship was a cathedral of living technology. Massive biomechanical structures twisted upward like the ribs of some impossible beast, pulsing with energy that felt warm and alive beneath Jake's hands. Streams of light flowed through crystalline conduits that grew from the walls like veins, carrying power to every system throughout the massive vessel. At the center of it all stood the primary control matrix, a towering spire of organic crystal that hummed with the combined consciousness of the ship's AI. Jake approached the control matrix with careful steps, aware that this was the moment when his plan would either succeed beyond his wildest hopes or fail catastrophically. The residual, psychic connection from the binding ritual was almost gone now, fading like an echo in his mind. He had perhaps minutes before his ability to interface with Zephyrian technology disappeared entirely. Behind him, the massive doors to the engine core slammed shut with a sound like thunder. Jake turned to see Queen Vexithara standing in the entrance, her four eyes blazing with an intensity that made the air around her shimmer with psychic energy. She had discarded her ceremonial armor in favor of practical combat gear, and her natural chitinous plates were scarred from fighting through her own ship to reach him. "Clever little human," she said, her voice carrying harmonics of rage and something that might have been admiration. "You have turned my own vessel against me, corrupted my crew with your alien thoughts, and stolen secrets that will cost my empire dearly. But your game ends here." Jake faced her calmly, his hand resting on the control matrix behind him. "It doesn't have to end at all. That's what you never understood about humans. We don't just fight to win, we fight to change things." The Queen moved closer, her psychic presence pressing against his mind like a physical weight. But where before, she had encountered the burning intensity of human determination, now she found something different. The memories she had absorbed during the failed ritual had changed her perceptions, and when she looked at Jake, she no longer saw a prize to be claimed or an enemy to be destroyed. She saw a young man who had sacrificed everything to protect his species, and the realization was more disturbing than any weapon. "You speak of change," she said, circling him like a predator studying its prey. "What change could you possibly offer? Your people are scattered, your technology primitive, your military doctrine laughably inefficient. You cannot defeat my empire through force." Jake smiled, and it was the same expression he had worn during their first meeting in the prison corridor, calm, confident, and utterly without fear. "You're right. We can't defeat you through force, but we don't have to." He pressed his palm against the control matrix and felt the ship's consciousness respond to his touch. The AI was vast and alien, but during his weeks of captivity, Jake had learned to recognize its patterns. Like all Zephyrian technology, it was designed to serve those it recognized as worthy. And after the binding ritual, after touching the Queen's mind and absorbing her memories, the AI recognized Jake as someone worthy of its attention. The ship's systems responded to his commands with eager efficiency. Throughout the vessel, Zephyrian soldiers found their weapons refusing to fire, their communications cut off, their very armor locking up and immobilizing them. In the prisoner quarters, force fields dissolved and doors opened, freeing hundreds of alien captives who had been taken during the Empire's various conquests. But Jake's real target was the invasion fleet itself. Through the flagship's command network, he reached out to every Zephyrian vessel in the Armada, sending not weapons or viruses, but something far more dangerous: truth. The data Jake transmitted contained more than just tactical intelligence. Hidden within the technical specifications and deployment schedules was every memory the Queen had forced him to experience during their conversations. The glory of conquest, the satisfaction of dominance, the crushing weight of absolute power, all of it was suddenly made available to every Zephyrian consciousness in the fleet. But alongside those memories came Jake's responses to them. The human perspective on freedom, on choice, on the right of every sentient being to determine their own destiny. The memories he had shared during the binding ritual, the art and music and love and hope that made human existence meaningful, all of it flowed through the Zephyrian network like a virus of enlightenment. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the invasion fleet, Zephyrian commanders found themselves questioning orders they had followed without thought for centuries. Soldiers experienced doubt about the righteousness of their cause. Workers began to wonder what their lives might be like if they could choose their own paths instead of serving the collective consciousness. Queen Vexithara felt the change rippling through her empire's psychic network, and for the first time in her long life, she experienced genuine fear. Not fear of death or defeat, but fear of losing everything that defined her identity and purpose. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice carrying desperate harmonics. Jake stepped away from the control matrix and faced her directly. "I've given your people the same thing you tried to take from me. Choice. The ability to decide for themselves what they want their lives to be." The Queen's four eyes narrowed as she processed the implications. "You have destroyed everything. Without the collective consciousness, without shared purpose, my empire will collapse into chaos." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "Or maybe it will become something better, something that doesn't require conquest and domination to exist." For a long moment, they stood in silence while the ship's AI continued broadcasting Jake's message to every corner of the Zephyrian Empire. Around them, the sounds of combat were fading as soldiers on both sides began to question what they were fighting for. Finally, the Queen spoke again, but her voice was different now, smaller, more uncertain. "The memories you forced into my mind during the ritual, the emotions your people feel, I cannot stop experiencing them. They have changed something fundamental about how I perceive reality." Jake nodded. "That's what understanding does. Once you really see something from another perspective, you can't go back to the way things were before." The Queen's natural armor began to shift and change, the rigid plates becoming more flexible as her psychic tension decreased. "Your species confuses me. You fight wars not to conquer, but to protect. You create art that serves no practical purpose. You sacrifice yourselves for abstract concepts that exist only in your minds. None of it makes logical sense." "Logic isn't everything," Jake said gently. "Sometimes the most important things are the ones that don't make sense but feel right anyway." Throughout the flagship, the sounds of battle had stopped completely. Human and Zephyrian voices could be heard in the corridors, not fighting but talking, trying to understand each other, learning to see their former enemies as fellow beings worthy of respect rather than obstacles to be overcome. The Queen looked around the engine core as if seeing it for the first time. "If I order the fleet to withdraw, to abandon the invasion, my own court will declare me unfit to rule. The Empire will tear itself apart in civil war." Jake considered this for a moment. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time for the Zephyrian people to decide for themselves what kind of society they want to live in. The Queen's four eyes focused on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You realize that if I do this, if I choose to spare your people, I will lose everything I have spent centuries building. But you'll gain something too," Jake replied. "The chance to build something new, something better, something that doesn't require other people to be less free so you can be more powerful." For several minutes, Queen Vexithara stood motionless, her consciousness reaching out through the psychic network to feel the pulse of her empire. What she found there was chaos, but it was the chaos of awakening rather than destruction. Her people were asking questions they had never thought to ask before, considering possibilities that had never existed in their ordered society. Finally, she turned to the ship's communication system and opened a channel to the entire invasion fleet. "This is Queen Vexithara," she said, her voice carrying across space to every Zephyrian vessel. "I am ordering an immediate withdrawal from human space. All ships are to return to our borders and await further instructions." The response was immediate and predictable. Half of her commanders demanded explanations while the other half questioned her authority to give such orders. But underneath the protests and confusion, Jake could hear something else: relief. Many of the Zephyrian soldiers had been changed by their exposure to human memories and emotions, and the idea of ending the war appealed to them more than they wanted to admit. As the invasion fleet began its chaotic withdrawal, Jake and the Queen stood together in the engine core. No longer captor and prisoner, but two beings trying to understand each other across the vast gulf of species and culture. That human will be mine, the Queen said softly, repeating the words that had started everything. Jake looked at her with curiosity. And now? The Queen's expression was thoughtful, almost sad. Now I think perhaps I understand what it means to be worthy of someone, rather than simply claiming them. It is a more difficult path, but perhaps a more meaningful one. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of Erie. Jake's new prison was unlike anything he had imagined. The Queen's personal chambers aboard the Zephyrian flagship were vast, with curved walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The floor was covered in something that felt like living metal beneath his feet, warm and slightly yielding. Strange sculptures rose from alcoves along the walls, their twisted forms seeming to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. He stood in the center of the main room, still wearing his torn uniform, while Zephyrian guards took positions near the entrances. The shackles on his wrists were not metal but some kind of energy field that hummed with power. When he tested them by pulling his hands apart, pain shot up his arms like liquid fire. "Do not struggle against the restraints," came a voice from behind him. "They respond to resistance with increasing discomfort." Jake turned to see Queen Vexus Thara entering through an archway that had not been there moments before. She had changed from her ceremonial armor into something that looked more like robes, though they still bore the same chitinous patterns as her natural shell. Her 4 eyes watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Welcome to your new home, human," she said, moving closer with that predatory grace he remembered from the corridor. "I trust you find it adequate." Jake looked around the chamber again, taking in details he had missed before. There were no visible doors except the one the Queen had used. No windows. No obvious means of escape. But there were ventilation grates, power conduits running along the ceiling, and what looked like maintenance panels disguised as decorative elements. "It's very nice," he said. "A bit over-decorated for my taste, but I suppose when you rule an empire, you can afford to be wasteful." The Queen's 4 eyes narrowed. She had expected fear, anger, or desperate bargaining. Instead, this young human was critiquing her interior design choices. She stepped closer until she loomed over him, her psychic presence pressing against his mind like a weight. "You seem remarkably calm for someone in your position," she said. "Perhaps you do not understand what has happened to you." Jake met her gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly. You've decided I'm some kind of prize worth keeping, which means you see value in me alive and relatively unharmed. That gives me options." "Options?" The Queen's voice carried a note of amusement. "What options could a prisoner possibly have?" "The option to learn," Jake said simply. Over the following days, Jake settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible to an outside observer. Each morning, Zephyrian servants would bring him food and attend to his basic needs. The meals were surprisingly good, though he had no idea what he was eating. The servants were smaller than the soldiers, with less pronounced armor plating, and they moved with nervous efficiency. Jake made it a point to be polite to them. He said please and thank you, asked about their day, and generally treated them like people rather than alien servants. At first they seemed confused by this behavior, but gradually he noticed them lingering a few moments longer during their tasks, and 1 or 2 had even begun to respond to his questions with hesitant words rather than silent efficiency. The Queen visited him regularly, sometimes twice a day. These conversations followed a pattern that Jake began to recognize. She would enter with some display of her power or wealth, attempting to overwhelm him with the scope of her empire. She showed him holographic displays of conquered worlds, each one a jewel in her collection. She demonstrated her psychic abilities by making objects move through the air or by briefly taking control of a servant's mind. "You see the futility of resistance," she would say, gesturing to images of burning cities or kneeling alien dignitaries. "Every species that has opposed me has fallen. Your people will be no different." Jake would listen, ask questions, and show what appeared to be growing interest in her explanations. He asked about Zephyrian history, their technology, their military structure. The Queen, pleased by what she interpreted as his gradual acceptance of his situation, answered more and more of his questions. What she didn't realize was that Jake was building a comprehensive intelligence file in his head. Every detail she shared, every casual comment about ship operations or fleet movements, every mention of other prisoners or resistance movements was carefully cataloged and analyzed. He learned that the Zephyrian psychic network had a hierarchical structure, with queens at the top and workers at the bottom. He discovered that their ships relied heavily on automated systems controlled by psychic interfaces. Most importantly, he began to understand their greatest weakness, their absolute confidence in their superiority. "Your people fight like animals," the Queen said during one of their sessions, showing him footage from human resistance battles on captured colonies. "No coordination, no shared purpose. Each one struggles alone against inevitable defeat." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That does seem inefficient. But then again, animals can be unpredictable. Sometimes they bite when you least expect it." The Queen's 4 eyes studied his face for any sign of hidden meaning, but Jake had become expert at controlling his expressions. She saw only what he wanted her to see, a young man slowly coming to terms with the reality of his situation. Meanwhile, Jake had not forgotten about his fellow prisoners. During his first week in captivity, he had identified 17 different maintenance shafts that connected various parts of the ship. The Zephyrian servants used these passages to move between sections without disturbing the ship's crew, and Jake had convinced one of them to show him the basic layout in exchange for what he claimed was human meditation techniques. The servant, whose name sounded like clicking stones when pronounced correctly, had been fascinated by Jake's description of human breathing exercises. In reality, Jake was teaching simple relaxation methods he had learned in basic training, but to a species accustomed to shared consciousness, the idea of individual mental control was revolutionary. Through clickstones and other servants, Jake began passing messages to the human prisoners in the lower decks. Nothing obvious, nothing that would trigger suspicion from the psychic overseers. Just casual mentions of maintenance schedules, shift changes, and security rotations that he had observed during his conversations with the Queen. Sergeant Santos received the first message 3 days after their capture, scratched into the metal of her food tray in a code that any human soldier would recognize. It was simple. "Stay ready, learn everything, trust no one but us." Over the following weeks, more messages followed. Guard rotation schedules, ship layout diagrams, information about Zephyrian weaknesses and tactical preferences. Jake was slowly building a network of information and resistance right under the Queen's nose. The Queen, for her part, was becoming increasingly fascinated by her prize. Jake's mind continued to resist her psychic probes, not through force but through what seemed like natural mental discipline. When she tried to read his surface thoughts, she found only calm acceptance and growing curiosity about Zephyrian culture. When she pressed deeper, she encountered the same burning intensity that had first caught her attention, but it was controlled now, channeled into what appeared to be genuine interest in learning from her. "You are adapting well to your circumstances," she observed during one of their evening conversations. They sat across from each other at a table made of the same living metal as the floor, sharing what the Queen considered a civilized meal. Jake took a bite of something that tasted like chicken but was bright blue in color. "Adaptation is a human survival trait. We're very good at making the best of bad situations. And yet your people continue to resist across the galaxy," the Queen said. "Even when resistance is clearly futile." Jake shrugged. "Maybe they haven't found the right reason to stop fighting yet." The Queen leaned forward, her 4 eyes intense. "And what reason would that be?" Jake met her gaze with apparent innocence. "Understanding, I suppose. It's hard to accept something you don't understand. But once you really know your enemy..." He paused and smiled. "Well, then you can make informed decisions about what comes next." The Queen studied his face for long moments, searching for hidden meanings. But Jake had become a master of the poker face, revealing nothing beyond what served his purposes. She saw only a young human who seemed to be genuinely wrestling with the reality of his situation, and the power of her empire. What she didn't see was the cold calculation behind his eyes, or the detailed plans forming in his mind. Jake Morrison was indeed learning about his enemy, but not for the reasons she imagined. Every day brought new intelligence, new understanding of Zephyrian capabilities and limitations, and every day, his fellow humans in the prison decks received new information, new hope, and new reasons to believe that their youngest member might just be planning something that could change everything. The game had begun in earnest, and Jake was playing by rules the Queen didn't even know existed. Part 3. The Ritual Reversed. The central chamber of the Zephyrian flagship had been transformed for the ceremony. What was normally a sterile command center now pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that crawled across the walls like living tattoos. Strange crystalline formations had been grown from the floor, their surfaces reflecting the violet light in hypnotic patterns. The air itself seemed thick with psychic energy, making Jake's teeth ache as he was led into the vast space. Hundreds of Zephyrians filled the chamber, arranged in precise circles around a raised platform at the center. Their four eyes all tracked Jake's movement as the guards escorted him forward, and he could feel the weight of their collective attention like a physical pressure against his mind. These were not just soldiers or servants, but the Queen's entire court, gathered to witness what they believed would be his final transformation from prisoner to willing slave. Queen Vexithara waited on the central platform, resplendent in ceremonial armor that seemed to be made of living shadow and starlight. The chitinous plates had been polished until they gleamed like black mirrors, and new growths of bone-like material had sprouted from her shoulders and head, forming elaborate crown-like structures that pulsed with their own inner light. She looked like a goddess of war, terrible and magnificent in equal measure. Jake was forced to his knees at the base of the platform while the Queen began the opening ritual. She spoke in the ancient Zephyrian tongue, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal formations ring like bells. The assembled court responded in unison, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to vibrate through Jake's bones. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel their intent. This was a binding ceremony, designed to chain his mind to hers for all eternity. During his weeks of captivity, Jake had learned much about Zephyrian psychic abilities through careful observation and questioning. Their power came from their ability to create mental connections, linking minds together in a vast network of shared consciousness. The stronger the Zephyrian, the more minds they could control simultaneously. Queens sat at the apex of this system. Their consciousness expanded across thousands of subjects. But Jake had also discovered something the Zephyrians didn't know about themselves. Their psychic abilities worked both ways. When they created a mental connection, information flowed in both directions. They were so confident in their mental superiority that they never considered the possibility of an alien mind fighting back, effectively much less winning. The Queen descended from the platform and approached Jake, her four eyes blazing with anticipation. She had waited weeks for this moment, carefully preparing him through their conversations and demonstrations of power. In her mind, he was already broken, simply awaiting the final touch that would make his submission permanent and complete. "You have learned much during your time with me," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber so all could hear. "You have seen the power of my empire, the futility of resistance, the beauty of surrender to a greater purpose. Tonight you will join with me in mind and spirit. You will become mine in every sense, and together we will rule the stars." Jake raised his head to meet her gaze. For weeks, he had practiced this moment in his mind, preparing for the psychic assault that was about to come. The Queen saw only acceptance in his eyes, the look of someone who had finally understood his place in her grand design. She was wrong. The binding ritual began with the Queen placing her clawed hands on either side of Jake's head. Her psychic presence, which had been pressing gently against his mind for weeks, suddenly intensified into a crushing assault designed to shatter his consciousness and rebuild it according to her will. It was a process she had performed hundreds of times on dozens of different species. None had ever resisted successfully. Jake's mind seemed to crack under the initial assault, his mental barriers crumbling like paper walls. The Queen's consciousness poured into the breach, ready to take control of his thoughts and memories. But instead of the broken fragments of a defeated mind, she encountered something impossible. Jake had spent weeks building a maze in his head. Every conversation with the Queen, every demonstration of power, every moment of apparent submission had been carefully catalogued and used to construct an elaborate mental construct designed specifically to trap a Zephyrian consciousness. When the Queen's mind entered his, she found herself in a labyrinth of human memory and emotion that she could not navigate or understand. The first corridor of the maze was filled with music, not the simple harmonics that Zephyrians used for communication, but the complex, chaotic beauty of human musical expression. Jake flooded the Queen's consciousness with everything from Bach to jazz, from tribal drums to electric guitars, each piece carrying emotional context that had no equivalent. In Zephyrian experience, the Queen reeled, her psychic probe stumbling as it tried to process sounds and feelings that had no reference point in her mental framework. The second corridor contained human art, Van Gogh's swirling skies, Michelangelo's divine figures, ancient cave paintings showing the first stirrings of human creativity. But more than just images, Jake shared the emotions and experiences that created them, the desperate beauty of an artist pouring his madness onto canvas, the spiritual ecstasy of a sculptor seeing God in marble, the simple joy of a child drawing stick figures of their family. The third corridor was love, not the biological imperatives that drove Zephyrian reproduction, or the hierarchical bonds that maintained their social structure, but the impossible, irrational, self-sacrificing love that humans felt for each other. Jake showed her mothers dying for children, soldiers sacrificing themselves for strangers, people choosing death rather than betraying their principles. He shared the love he felt for his family, his friends, his species, and his world. The fourth corridor contained laughter. The Queen's mind, designed to process information through logical hierarchies and shared experiences, simply could not understand why humans found things funny. Jake bombarded her with jokes, pranks, sarcasm, and the simple joy of laughing with friends. Each memory carried emotional weight that her psychic abilities absorbed whether she wanted to or not. The final corridor was the most dangerous of all. It contained hope. Jake shared every moment in human history when people had refused to accept defeat, when they had fought against impossible odds, simply because they believed in something better. The Queen's consciousness, accustomed to the ordered despair of conquered species, was utterly unprepared for the blazing defiance that humans carried in their hearts even in the darkest moments. The psychic feedback was catastrophic. The Queen's scream echoed both audibly and telepathically through the chamber, causing every Zephyrian present to stagger as their shared network was flooded with alien concepts their minds could not process. Several of the younger courtiers collapsed entirely, their consciousness overloaded by the sudden influx of pure, undiluted humanity. But Jake wasn't finished. As the Queen struggled to withdraw from his mind, he pressed his advantage. Instead of simply defending, he began to push back, his consciousness following her retreating probe, like a virus spreading through a computer network. For the first time in her centuries of existence, Queen Vexthera experienced what it felt like to be invaded, to have alien thoughts forced into her mind against her will. Jake showed her Earth. Not the strategic information she had sought, but the emotional reality of his homeworld, the smell of rain on summer afternoons, the sound of children playing in parks, the feeling of grass beneath bare feet. He shared Christmas mornings and birthday parties, graduation ceremonies and wedding dances, all the small moments of joy that made human life worth living. More than that, he showed her what the Zephyrian invasion meant to his species. Not the grand strategic picture of empire building that she saw, but the personal reality of families torn apart, children growing up as slaves, entire cultures erased in the name of order and efficiency. He made her feel the grief and rage and desperate hope that drove human resistance across the galaxy. The Queen's psychic grip on Jake's mind shattered completely. She staggered backward, her four eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. Around the chamber, Zephyrian courtiers were picking themselves up from the floor, their mental composure slowly returning as the psychic storm subsided. Jake rose to his feet, the energy shackles around his wrists sparking and failing as the ship's systems responded to the psychic chaos. He looked directly at the Queen, and for the first time since his capture, he smiled without hiding his true intentions. "You wanted to know what makes humans special," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "We don't break the way you expect us to. We bend, we adapt, we learn, but we never stop being human. And now you know what that really means." The Queen tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. The memories and emotions Jake had, forced into her consciousness, were still there, changing the way she saw everything around her. Her empire, her power, her very identity were all suddenly viewed through the lens of human experience, and what she saw was not the glorious conquest she had always believed in, but something far more complex and troubling. Part 4. Hunters Become Hunted. The corridors of the Zephyrian flagship erupted into chaos as emergency klaxons wailed through the biometallic halls. Red warning lights pulsed in rhythm with the alarms, casting everything in a hellish glow that made the organic walls appear to bleed. Throughout the massive vessel, Zephyrian crew members stumbled and reeled as the psychic feedback from the failed binding ritual continued to echo through their shared consciousness like ripples in a disturbed pond. Jake sprinted through the maintenance tunnels he had memorized during his weeks of captivity, his torn uniform now completely shredded from crawling through narrow spaces designed for much smaller beings. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit as Zephyrian soldiers attempted to navigate passages they rarely used, their larger frames struggling with spaces that Jake could move through with practiced ease. The ship's layout was burned into his memory like a three-dimensional map. Every corridor, every junction, every access panel had been catalogued during his apparent cooperation with Queen Vexithera. What the Queen had interpreted as submission and acceptance had actually been the most comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation in human military history. In the lower decks, Sergeant Santos led her fellow prisoners through their own carefully planned breakout. The energy locks on their cells had failed during the psychic storm, just as Jake had predicted they would. The Zephyrian guard systems relied heavily on psychic interfaces, and the chaos in the collective consciousness had created exactly the kind of system-wide failure he had been counting on. "Move fast and stay quiet," Santos whispered to the dozen humans following her through the prisoner transport bay. "Morrison's given us maybe 30 minutes before they get their systems back online. We need to be in position by then." "Corporal." Chen clutched a maintenance tool he had pulled from an emergency kit, the closest thing to a weapon any of them had managed to find. "Sarge, what exactly is the plan here? Even if we take control of this ship, there's still an entire invasion fleet out there." Santos checked the corridor ahead before responding. "One crisis at a time, Chen. Right now we focus on staying alive and helping Morrison with whatever crazy scheme he's cooking up." What Morrison was cooking up would have been considered impossible by any rational military strategist. Rather than trying to escape or simply survive, Jake was attempting to take control of the entire flagship, not through brute force, which would have been suicide, but through the kind of asymmetric warfare that humans had perfected over centuries of fighting against superior opponents. Jake emerged from a ventilation shaft directly into the ship's primary data core, a vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with information. Zephyrian technology was a fusion of biological and mechanical systems, with data stored in living crystals that responded to psychic commands. It was incredibly advanced and efficient, but it had one critical weakness that Jake had identified. During his conversations with the Queen, the entire system assumed that anyone accessing it would be Zephyrian. There were no security protocols designed to prevent access by alien minds, because the designers had never conceived that such a thing would be possible. After all, what non-psychic species could possibly interface with technology that required mental commands to operate? Jake pressed his hands against the largest crystal formation and closed his eyes. During the binding ritual, when his consciousness had been linked with the Queen's, he had absorbed more than just her memories and emotions. He had also gained a temporary understanding of how Zephyrian psychic interfaces worked. The connection was fading, but he still had enough residual capability to access the ship's basic systems. The crystal warmed under his touch as he fed commands into the data core. Navigation systems, internal communications, environmental controls, all of it was accessible if you knew how to ask for it properly. Jake began systematically locking down sections of the ship, creating choke points and safe zones that would give the human prisoners tactical advantages in the fighting to come. But his real target was much more ambitious. Hidden within the ship's navigation database was information about the entire Zephyrian invasion fleet, deployment schedules, target lists, tactical assessments of human defenses, everything Earth's military would need to mount an effective defense. Jake began copying the data to a secure partition in the ship's memory core, one that only he would be able to access. Meanwhile, Queen Vexthera struggled to maintain her composure as her world fell apart around her. The memories Jake had forced into her consciousness during the ritual continued to surface at random moments, showing her fragments of human experience that she couldn't ignore or forget. The sound of a child's laughter echoed in her mind as she tried to coordinate the search for escaped prisoners. The image of two humans embracing flashed before her eyes as she attempted to restore order to her psychically disrupted crew. For the first time in her centuries of existence, Vexthera was experiencing doubt. Not about her power, which remained formidable, but about the righteousness of her cause. The human memories had shown her conquest from the perspective of the conquered, and the view was far different from anything she had imagined. "My queen," said General Thexvor, her primary military advisor, as he entered her private chambers. His natural armor was scorched from the psychic feedback, and 2 of his 4 eyes were dim with exhaustion. "The escaped prisoners have seized the auxiliary command center. They are using the maintenance tunnels to move throughout the ship, striking at our forces and disappearing before we can respond." The Queen turned to face him, and Thexvor stepped back involuntarily. Her 4 eyes burned with an intensity he had never seen before, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like pain. "How many humans are we facing?" she asked. 13 confirmed, including the one you claimed as your prize. They appear to be coordinating their attacks through some form of primitive communication system we cannot intercept. Vexthera almost laughed at the irony. The Zephyrians, with their advanced psychic network, were being outmaneuvered by humans, using nothing more than scratched messages and hand signals. It was exactly the kind of resourceful adaptation that Jake had shown her in his memories. The refusal to accept defeat even when all rational options were exhausted. "Double the guard details," she ordered. "Seal all maintenance access points. I want that human found and brought to me alive." But even as she gave the orders, Vexthera knew they would not be enough. Jake Morrison had spent weeks learning every detail of her ship's operations, and he was using that knowledge with a precision that was both admirable and terrifying. More than that, he had infected her mind with human concepts that made it increasingly difficult to see him as simply an enemy to be destroyed. In the ship's communication center, Jake completed his infiltration of the data core and began the next phase of his plan. Using the Queen's own communication systems, he broadcast a message on frequencies that would reach every human ship and colony within 50 light years. The message was simple: detailed technical specifications of Zephyrian shields, weapons, and tactical doctrine, along with the complete deployment schedule for the invasion fleet. But that wasn't the message's most important component. Hidden within the technical data was proof that humanity could fight back effectively against their psychic overlords. Jake Morrison, 19 years old and barely 3 months out of basic training, had not only resisted Zephyrian mental domination, but had turned it against them. If one human could accomplish that, then maybe humanity as a whole had a chance. The transmission complete, Jake made his way toward the ship's engine core. He had saved the most audacious part of his plan for last. The Zephyrian flagship wasn't just a warship, it was the command vessel for the entire invasion fleet. Its destruction would throw the alien forces into chaos and buy Earth precious time to prepare its defenses. But Jake had no intention of destroying the ship. Instead, he was going to steal it. As he moved through the corridors toward his final objective, Jake couldn't help but smile. The Queen had been right about one thing during their conversations. Humans were adaptable. They learned from their enemies, adopted new tactics, and found ways to turn disadvantages into strengths. She had wanted to make him hers. Instead, he was about to make her ship his. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, but not in the way anyone had expected, and Jake Morrison was just getting started. Part 1. The Capture. The vacuum of space held the broken remains of what had once been humanity's pride. The UES Defiance drifted like a wounded beast among the debris field, her hull cracked open in 3 places, atmosphere bleeding out and frozen, clouds that sparkled against the distant stars. Emergency lights flickered weakly through shattered viewports, casting an orange glow across twisted metal that had been pristine corridors just hours before. Private Jake Morrison pressed his back against the cold bulkhead and tried to control his breathing. His standard-issue uniform was torn at the shoulder, and a thin line of blood had dried across his forehead where flying debris had caught him during the attack. Around him, the other survivors sat in stunned silence. Some stared at their hands. Others gazed out through the cracked viewport at the massive alien vessels that surrounded their crippled ship, like predators circling wounded prey. Jake was 19 years old. 3 months ago, he had been working at his uncle's garage in New Detroit, dreaming of seeing the stars. Now he was about to become a prisoner of war in a conflict he barely understood, fought against enemies that humanity had only encountered 6 months ago. The irony was not lost on him, but fear had a way of making such thoughts seem small and distant. The Zephyrian ships were unlike anything in human design. Where human vessels were built for efficiency and function, these alien craft seemed grown, rather than constructed. Their hulls curved in organic patterns covered in what looked like chitinous armor that shifted color in the starlight. Massive spike-like projections extended from their bows, and Jake had seen firsthand how those spikes could punch through human shields like they were made of paper. Sergeant Maria Santos moved among the survivors, checking wounds and whispering words of encouragement. She was a career soldier, 20 years in the service, and her presence helped keep the younger troops calm. When she reached Jake, she knelt beside him and examined the cut on his forehead. "How are you holding up, Morrison?" she asked quietly. Jake met her eyes. There was something in his gaze that made her pause. Where she expected to see fear or despair, she found only cold determination. It was unusual in someone so young, especially someone who had never seen real combat before today. "I'm fine, Sergeant," he said. "What's our situation?" Santos glanced around to make sure the others weren't listening too closely. "Not good. Main power is down, communications are dead, and life support is running on backup cells. We've got maybe 6 hours of air left." She paused. "But that's not our biggest problem." As if summoned by her words, a deep vibration ran through the ship's hull. The sound of docking clamps engaging echoed through the corridor, followed by the distinctive hiss of airlocks cycling. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Their biggest problem had just arrived. The first Zephyrian soldier to enter the corridor was nearly 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in natural armor plates that gleamed like black metal, and its head was elongated, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern around a mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. It carried no visible weapon, but Jake had heard the intelligence briefings. Zephyrians were psychic. They could kill with a thought. More soldiers followed, moving with predatory grace as they secured the area. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, as if they shared a single mind. In a way, Jake realized they probably did. The intelligence reports had mentioned something about a collective consciousness, a psychic network that connected all members of their species. The human survivors were forced to their feet and herded into a single group. Jake found himself standing next to Corporal Chen, a demolitions expert who had been aboard the Defiance for 2 years. Chen was trembling, and Jake could see sweat beading on the older man's forehead despite the cold air. "Stay calm," Jake whispered. "They want us alive or we'd already be dead." Chen looked at him in surprise. "How can you be so calm? These things can read minds, Morrison. They can make you do whatever they want." Jake shrugged. "Then there's nothing we can do about it, is there? Might as well save our energy for when we can make a difference." Before Chen could respond, the corridor filled with a presence that made every human step backward instinctively. Even the Zephyrian soldiers seemed to straighten their posture, their four eyes fixed on the airlock as something far more dangerous than mere soldiers entered their prison. Queen Vexithara was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. She stood nearly 10 feet tall, her natural armor polished to a mirror shine that reflected the emergency lights in rippling patterns. Her head was crowned with bone-like projections that curved backward like a natural tiara, and her four eyes glowed with an inner violet light that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the soul beneath. She moved through the corridor with the confidence of absolute power. When she looked at something, it was with the casual interest of a collector examining potential acquisitions. Her psychic presence pressed against the minds of every human present, and Jake could feel her, consciousness brushing against his thoughts like cold fingers. The Queen stopped in front of the group of prisoners and began her inspection. When her gaze fell on Sergeant Santos, Jake felt a brief spike of psychic energy. Santos stiffened and her eyes went blank for a moment before she shook her head and stepped back. "This one has seen much combat," the Queen said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that made the words seem to come from inside Jake's own head. "Strong, experienced, but—" She tilted her head. "Limited. Her mind is like a fortress, but a fortress built to withstand known enemies." She moved on to Corporal Chen, who began shaking more violently as she approached. Another pulse of psychic energy, and Chen collapsed to his knees, gasping. The Queen barely glanced at him. Weak. Afraid. Such minds break too easily to be of interest. One by one, she examined each prisoner, her psychic probes leaving some dizzy, others nauseated, and a few completely stunned. Jake watched and waited, studying her patterns, memorizing the way she moved and spoke. When she finally reached him, he was ready. The Queen's psychic touch hit his mind like a sledgehammer. Jake felt her consciousness pressing against his thoughts, trying to peel back the layers of his personality to examine what lay beneath. But instead of resistance or fear, she encountered something unexpected. Jake's mind didn't fight her probe. Instead, it absorbed it, channeled it, turned it into something else entirely. For the first time in her long life, Queen Vexithara felt surprise. Where she expected to find the ordered thoughts of a trained soldier or the chaotic panic of a frightened young man, she instead discovered a mind that burned with crystalline intensity. Jake's thoughts moved in, patterns she couldn't predict, driven by a determination so pure it was almost painful to touch. There was no fear in him, only calculation, no despair, only planning, and beneath it all, a core of something she had never encountered before: absolute, unwavering defiance. The Queen withdrew her psychic probe and stared at Jake with all four eyes. He met her gaze without flinching, his expression calm and alert. Around them, the other prisoners and Zephyrian soldiers waited in silence. "Interesting," she said finally. Her head tilted as she continued to study him. "You are young, untrained, weak by any measure my people would use." She paused. "And yet your mind burns brighter than a star. How is this possible?" Jake smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Maybe you're just not looking in the right place." The Queen's four eyes narrowed. She had ruled for over 3 centuries, had conquered dozens of worlds, had broken the spirits of thousands of warriors. But this young human, barely more than a child by his species standards, looked at her without fear. More than that, he looked at her as if he knew something she didn't. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey studied each other. Then the Queen straightened to her full height and pointed one clawed appendage directly at Jake. "That human will be mine," she declared, her voice carrying across the corridor with the weight of absolute authority. Her court of advisors and soldiers murmured in surprise. Traditionally, queens claimed the strongest warriors, the most experienced leaders. But Queen Vexithara saw something in this young human that the others missed. Something that called to her in ways she didn't fully understand. Jake felt the weight of her decision settle around him like chains, but his expression never changed. As the other prisoners were led away to the holding cells, and Zephyrian guards flanked him for the journey to the Queen's personal chambers, he caught Sergeant Santos's eye and gave her the slightest nod. The hunt was beginning. But Jake Morrison had no intention of being anyone's prey.